Hello all. In today's lesson, we will be looking at postcolonialism, postcolonial studies and ecological thought. Why is it important to study these two apparently disparate disciplines together? Postcolonial theory, which looks at the history of colonial empires and its effects on various nations such as Africa, in African, Asian continents, and ecology, which is about the environment. Let's offer as an introduction a justification for bringing these together. If you look carefully at the world around us, many of the things that happen at the level of the country in the third world, so-called third world nations, or the global south as they are now called, are the direct effects of global policies, as we have looked at in our previous lesson. And any post-colonial studies looking at the history of colonial domination has to account for the continuing forms of this domination in the 21st century, 20th century globalized era. So let's begin with a basic assumption. Ecological thought and ecological concerns are not uniform across the global north and the global south. What the United States or other developed nations might expect out of ecology and the commitment to ecological thinking are not necessarily the same as what countries in the global south will want. Countries in the global south are characterized by what has been called the environmentalism of the poor, phrase and a concept coined by Ramachandra Guha and Juan Martinez Alier. Ram Guha, arguably India's best known environmental historian, and Martinez Alier argue that for people in the global south, the primary concern is sustainable living and livelihood, and as such they are interested primarily in the equitable distribution of natural resources and their control over these resources, not necessarily that the control of resources should be done by the state, as in the government or multinational corporations. For many of the environmental activists, therefore, these resources have to be defended against both the market and the state. Environmentalism of the poor is also attentive to the role that women have, for example, in environmental issues and how they become victims or activists or propagandists in the face of ecological crises. They speak of corporate environmental responsibility, and they speak about the link between social and economic justice and ecology. So for many of the post-colonial ecological critics, there is very little difference between economic and political power and ecological justice and ecological fairness. What are the post-colonial approaches to ecology and the environmental humanities? Most of them begin with critiques of colonial imperial forest and conservation policies, plantation and garden cultures, land sealing acts, etc. For those of you who are familiar with the work of either Ramachandra Guha or Mahesh Rangarajan, you would know this, that they have written substantial critiques of colonial policies on topics like hunting, conservation, and whose ecological consequences we now can see. It involves critiques of state colonial, post-colonial policies of development, modernity, land ownership and industrialization. That is, the critique of the idea of development itself. They are concerned with internally displaced persons as a consequence of developmental projects, nativism as a political agenda, native resistance movements and their histories, and so on and so forth. They are interested in biocolonialization. Biocolonization is the dominance of Western technologies, including new things like cloning or stem cell work, or bioprospecting, and what it means for the global south. So for instance, questions of reproductive rights and surrogacy that people like Kalindi Vohra have studied are about post-colonial feminist readings of Western technologies that come and use native bodies here for their purposes and for their markets, a theme commonly called bioprospect. Post-colonial approaches to ecologies also include a concern with environmental racisms. And allow me to direct you back to the first slide in this particular lesson. This is Lawrence Summers, a professor of economics at Harvard, who goes on to become the president of the World Bank, who actually wrote a memo suggesting that, look at what he's saying there in the last lines. Shouldn't the World Bank be encouraging more migration of the dirty industries to the least developed countries? What he's saying is those industries which are ecologically threatening or ecologically damaging can simply be opened up in Africa, because after all their pollution is not really an issue. That is what calls for a post-colonial environmentalism. This Summers' statement is actually an instance of environmental racism, because what he's doing is he's linking ecological collapse or ecological crisis with actual racial divides and racist policies. A second concern, rather, is with the linkage between poverty and ecological issues, local levels of risk from deforestation, global warming, desertification. That is, you can't think of ecological change across all classes as being the same. It's not. Those at the level of the very poor and those at the level of the very rich have different mechanisms, if any, to cope with environmental change. There's a strong concern with the role of multinational corporations and global powers within the nation, their destructive environmental policies. Our next one will be bioregionalism. Bioregionalism is a locale-specific approach, political, historical, economic, cultural, to the economy, ecology and life forms in a particular domain. It emerged sometime in the 1970s, and if you look at practically any bioregional text, they will work only with very small territories. A bioregion consists of climate, soils, minerals, landforms, water bodies and all of those. But it also pays attention to cultural terms and asks us to pay attention to questions like myths, histories and cultural practices of native cultures, and the remnants of past cultures and the modes of habitation of the present population. The key features of bioregionalism include things that we have already in passing looked at: the effects of globalization at local levels and regional levels. It involves the use of local folklore, local myths and cultural forms in art, artifactual pieces, literature, towards consciousness raising about the place. It calls for a politics rooted in a particular set of local conditions. Now please understand this, the local conditions may have been determined partially or entirely by global conditions, but the bioregional focus is only upon that. So if you look at a novel like Swarga, the first novel on endosulfan and the endosulfan tragedy in Kerala, which came out last year, the assumption of the book is that there is a set of chemicals that has caused severe damage to an entire locality. But the overarching concern is not just bioregionalism. It locates this fascination with pesticides, highly productive farming techniques with a global issue, that our native systems of farming, for example, have been eroded in favor of this global move. So it calls for a politics rooted in local conditions, and they are very interested in local programs of action, as in what can we do about it at this particular level, that you don't think of global change at once, you begin at the level of the local. We have several times in the last few lessons mentioned Rob Nixon's slow violence. Slow violence is about the insidious, slow, invisible violence that occurs in all forms of erosion across the world. The point Nixon makes is, it's not tangible. Climate change or pollution is not tangible, it's not immediate. It works over a long period of time, and therefore it's important to pay attention to incremental processes. Slow violence as an important theme has found occurrence even before he formulated that, when you look at people like Rachel Carson. Let's now move on to postcolonial ecotropes and ecocriticism, where texts like C.K. Janu's or the novel I just mentioned, Swarga, are studies of postcolonial bioregional texts. They have a very specific trajectory. One is a concern with the environment, but the other is a concern with postcolonial development practices and development policies. That is, they are keen on discovering the link between ecological destruction and postcolonial nation states and their policies. So there is a very strong interest in say, the building of large dams, or the way the displaced people have been treated, the kind of patent record over, say, neem and other natively grown materials. It involves the representations of animals and other life forms, the emergence of bioethics in terms of bodies, organs, clinical trials and others. It involves notions of environmental and social justice. Let me now move on to my conclusion. It should be obvious by now that postcolonialism as a critical field, as a methodological approach, as a theoretical tool, has very significant roles to play in ecological criticism and the environmental humanities. From what we have seen, we have looked at ecological troping, ecotropes, we have looked at slow violence, we have looked at environmental racisms as a part of globalization. but also as a part of bioregional texts and bioregional politics. Do understand this. Postcolonial approaches to the environmental humanities is not only about the global, it's also about things like post-colonial states and their national policies. These policies which adversely affect the environment. Thank you.